Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. What would you do if you had a neighbor country that was about 10 times your size in terms of population and resources, and the leader of that country announced that he would like to take over your country and make you into a state in his? Hmm? What would you do about that? Would you defend yourself? Would you placate him? What would you do? Well, we're not so sure ourselves. I'm living in Canada, and next door is a guy named Donald Trump who has said that he would like for Canada to become the 51st state of the United States, and that he's going to be using economic pressures and who knows what else in order to make that happen, because obviously the Canadian population is not enthusiastic about the idea and will not do it gladly. So he has some plans, and we don't know what all those plans are, but we're already feeling the effect of some of them. So I am very happy today to say that we're going to have a conversation about this issue. So I have two guests with me. Richard Sandbrook is a professor emeritus of political science, University of Toronto, and now currently the vice president of Science for Peace. And Isaiah Ritzmann does educational projects for his organization or his church, his religious community. So both of them are convinced advocates of nonviolence and looking for ways of defending their whenever defense is needed by using nonviolent protests and other means of actual interference with invaders or other people who are aggressive. So I will ask Richard to begin by telling us a little bit about your project now, and then I'm sure that Isaiah has thoughts on this, and you can go wherever you want with that conversation. Hi, Richard.
Yes, well, I should preface my remarks by saying that Isaiah and I are both involved in a newly formed Canadian Coalition for Nonviolent Defence. We've been meeting weekly since late June and have members of our steering committee from all parts of Canada. And, you know, the immediate spur for our interest was the threats by Trump to make Canada the 51st state. Not just, he hasn't said that just once, but many times in different forms. And the same idea has been propagated by right-wing influencers on social media in the United States. It does appear to be something that Canadians should take seriously. Of course, it doesn't mean that the US will invade Canada anytime soon or at all. But the probability of such an invasion is not zero. It depends on so many contingent factors. If Trump manages to consolidate his dictatorship, and if there is an opening for a U.S. invasion, for example, the referendum on independence or separation in Alberta that is contested and provides Trump with some kind of a pretext for safeguarding the right of Albertans to secede from Canada, something of that nature. But the problem for Canada is not only that if there was to be an invasion of part of Canada, such as Alberta, it's not only that we'd be outgunned, as obviously we would be, but also that Canada's armed forces are heavily integrated into with United States forces within NORAD and NATO for that matter, but especially NORAD with a common command structure, common training exercises. In terms of weaponry, we are dependent on U.S. weapons and ammunition and know-how. and in strategy and in terms of integration of strategy. So it's very hard for the US, for the Canadian armed forces, to even regard the United States as a security threat, let alone think of taking any action. In any event, we wouldn't want the Canadian Army to take action. It would lead to devastating damage and casualties in Canada. So we don't want that. So it's from this kind of perspective, we became interested again. I mean, we'd been previously interested, I think both of us, in the concept of civilian-based defense, which was a term used by Gene Sharp, who was a major thinker in this field of nonviolent action, and other Europeans as well, and what we refer to as nonviolent action, nonviolent defense. So we already had a long-term interest in this, while the Canadian situation was such as to suggest that for Canada, really the only option we would have in a case of a US invasion would be civilian-based defense. And therefore, it was worth exploring in a larger context within Canada how we might develop this idea. Of course, it is very much a fringe idea right now, and has been since it was initiated in the 1970s. There was a lot of discussion from the 1970s into the early 2000s about civilian-based defense or nonviolent defense, but that fell by the wayside after that era. So we are returning to that idea in the context of Canada, but also way more generally in the sense of demilitarization. That if we want to have demilitarization, that is a reduction in defense budgets worldwide, then one aspect of that move would be expansion of civilian-based defense. But I'll let Isaiah carry on from that point.
In terms of like a US invasion of Canada, I think about it in the same way that I might think about a car crash. When we're in a car, we wear our seatbelts, not because car crashes are often or probable, but because the contingency of a car crash is serious enough, we take precautions in terms of wearing a seatbelt. So in terms of like the probability of a US invasion, I'll just reinforce what Richard is saying. We're not saying it's probable, but it is now possible and thinkable in a way that it hasn't been. And with the rise of the far right, not only in the United States, but globally, Canadians need to be prepared long term that even if Trump is out of the picture, the far right and the United States, especially if they take over government, will be a continued threat, especially in an era of climate change, and other ecological challenges in terms of water and resources. Canada needs to actually be seriously concerned that if not in the next 5 years, then possibly within the next 50, something like a US invasion is a real threat. It might not be something we would say it's probable, but it's certainly worth thinking about. And for some of the reasons Richard mentioned, we are outgunned by the US military. The European reliance on US economic trade means that if there is an invasion of Canada, it's unlikely Europe would come to our aid. We have such a long, undefended border. Our populations are so mismatched. Like, we're just not in a position, even if a military defense is a good thing, we aren't in a position to actually have a military defense. So we think it's wise to begin preparing for a nonviolent alternative, relying on both the research and traditions of nonviolent resistance going back way over a century, both in terms of on-the-ground practice in countries that have had human rights abuses or have had authoritarian governments and have used nonviolent resistance, as well as the whole scholarship that has studied on it. There's a lot to learn. And while applying nonviolence to defense problems is novel, we believe it's both really important for Canada. It's both a cutting edge innovation, but something that would have multiple benefits for us to adopt, as well as like a long-term plan for demilitarization. We believe if societies have a credible way of defending themselves without reliance on militaries, we can actually see the reduction of militaries worldwide.
And I think also another element of that is that if you know you're going to need to do it, there's a lot to be gained by getting started before you need it. The planning and the organizing, if you have it all set up so that everybody knows what they're going to do when the time comes, then things click into place without stress. And that is hard to do because when people don't know that anything bad is likely or imminent, they're not ready to participate. So I think you're going to have the immediate challenge is getting people convinced that it's worth doing now, planning now and getting ready for it now, even though it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, if at all.
So one can imagine that in terms of careers, in terms of economic interests, in terms of the think tanks that provide intellectual justification, we are working against the grain, to put it mildly.
I think the example of the Danish resistance to Nazi occupation in World War II is really interesting. With the Nazi invasion of Denmark, the government and military realized that the disproportionate power of the German military meant there was no point of having a military resistance because people would have just died. Repression would have been stronger, but they would have gotten nowhere with it. So they did not, they laid down their arms, but in civil society, a mass spontaneous civil resistance began. There was a young 17-year-old boy who wrote for his hometown a document called 10 Commandments for Danes. And this was, prior to the whole literature on nonviolent resistance, prior to Michael Beer's 350 methods of nonviolence, Gene Sharp's 200 methods of nonviolence. He just wrote 10 commandments for Danes about how to nonviolently resist Nazis, including do a bad job for the Nazis, don't shop at their stores, socially ostracize any of our countrymen who collaborate with them, like things like that. So this document of 10 commandments the 17-year-old wrote for his hometown spread across the entire country and became the framework in which the Danes was, to a degree, successfully resisted the Nazis. I say to a degree because the Nazis occupied Denmark through World War II, but the amount of internal sovereignty they were still able to maintain, as well as the fact that something like less than 200 Danish Jews actually perished in the Holocaust because Denmark had such solidarity, they were able to protect their entire Jewish population, partially because of the collective nonviolent resistance. I use that as an example because clearly, even without preparation, nonviolent resistance had a level of effect there. But what I'm thinking is preparation exists on a continuum. It's not binary. It's not either you are unprepared or you're fully prepared. It can exist in the in-between. And as a coalition, we don't know to the degree we can get to fully prepared yet, but we believe if we're like 1 or 2 degrees more prepared than not prepared at all, that will be a good thing. Like we could create the social framework in Canada so that if an invasion comes, even if our government isn't ready for it, we could have chapters on the ground ready to disseminate nonviolent resistance tactics. And that in and of itself would be a good thing.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yes,
They had so many clever things, really interesting things, like saying that, well, we got to go home and water our victory gardens in the afternoon, so we can't do a full day's work. Or the workers would be supposed to be building ships for the Nazis, and when there's a soldier behind them, they'd be screwing in the screws, and when the soldier went away, they'd unscrew them so they wouldn't be working. And that kind of resistance at an individual level, but also, in so many other ways. People don't pretend they didn't understand the German soldiers when they were told to do something, they didn't get it, and things like that. So it's so much fun to read some of the cases, stories about people who resist. Richard, I know you've read a lot of those various books, not just about the Danes, but other cases of nonviolent resistance.
Well, right next door in Norway was another good example of nonviolent resistance. In this case, it was the Norwegian Teachers Union refusing to implement a Nazi curriculum in their schools. Mm-hmm. And even they resisted in all kinds of ways. And if they were, including closing down schools when necessary, they were joined by the parents. It wasn't just teachers. The parents wrote thousands of letters and made all kinds of complaints about the Nazi curriculum to the Minister of Education, to the government, and teachers. When schools were shut down for non-adherence, would teach classes sometimes in their own homes on a private basis.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this did lead to the arrest of thousands of teachers, to about 1,000 teachers being actually detained in concentration camps, and but only about, I think it was 10 ended up actually dying from. Still, 10 is not a small number from a small country. So they managed. So eventually, the Nazi government, Quisling, under the advice of Hitler, gave up the project of instituting a Nazi curriculum in the Norwegian schools. So in that case, nonviolent resistance was effective, at least at the level of teaching children.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, I almost think that nonviolent resistance is a natural response of human societies. I mean, if you think about Canada in the face of Trump's bullying in the past past 10 months, the Canadians have responded by boycotting American goods, by refusing to fly to the United States. Some Canadians who own property in the U.S. have sold that to return home. And so in a number of ways, there has been this resistance in Canada. So it's almost kind of a natural reaction. But of course, there are degrees, as Isaiah said, it's not a matter of either spontaneous or planned. We have to get beyond that, understanding there's a continuum. To give you an example of that would be the three Baltic states who, in the beginning of the 1990s, won their independence from the Soviet Union. And they, at that point, in the early 1990s, were very interested in civilian-based defense and had a lot of research done on it. And because for the reason that they had won independence non-violently, basically. So non-violence to them was something that they had learned through practice, in the same way the Poles had in resisting the Soviet domination, the Polish people. So that their experience of nonviolent action and success in relation to Russia really made them more interested in civilian-based defense. As it turned out, they joined NATO and basically lost most of their interest in civilian-based defense, although there's more of it in Lithuania, for example, even today, than in almost any other country.
I would also add to that I believe it was Lithuania in 1996, when they were developing their constitution and Ministry of Defense, they actually adopted, to build on what Richard was saying, explicitly Gene Sharp's idea of civilian-based defense, what we call nonviolent defense, just to clarify things. So in their training, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, they both trained civilians in the case of a coup d'etat or an invasion, what to do, like what nonviolent resistance tactics they would need to do, both at a practical level as well as like a more strategic level. But they also trained sectors in society. So they would train kind of government ministries, healthcare, education. So they took the two-pronged defense approach of both of a nonviolent defense approach of both training citizens to use civil resistance, nonviolent resistance, as well as sectors of society. And we envision something like that being the direction. Now, just to build on what Richard was saying, the original vision of Gene Sharp and some of the other activists and scholars during the Cold War who pushed for unarmed civilian defense was what they called transarmament, which was a term originally coined by Kenneth Boulding, who is an economist in the 1930s. So transarmament is not disarmament, where disarmament is like a country giving up its military capabilities or defense capabilities. But transarmament is transitioning from a military defense capabilities to nonviolent defense capabilities. And the idea being that countries could actually gradually demilitarize themselves by implementing effective, credible, collective nonviolent defense policies. And the idea being it could reverse like a reverse or could initiate a reverse arms race. So just as you had kind of mutually assured destruction through the buildup of nuclear weapons, you could have the opposite kind of process through nonviolent defense. But as we saw, it didn't quite achieve the level of effectiveness that it could have, partially because it was really interesting to people in Europe living under the shadow of the Soviet Union. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, that sort of initial impetus, the context changed, and so the incentive structure changed. But we at the Canadian Coalition really believe it's something worthwhile, not only for Canada to move towards, but globally. People will always need to defend themselves, but if they could have a non-violent means of doing so, that would help not only achieve peace, but relationships between states that weren't as costly environmentally.
This doesn't mean that which cannot be defended through, in my view, through a nonviolent defense, because there are so few people in the North, and you do need a population to be effective. So it isn't that we're talking about the abolition in the near term of the armed forces, but that at the very least there needs over time to be a joint deployment of nonviolent defense and armed defense. It'd be very hard to work out, but as an interim stage, it would make a great deal of sense. And I would point out that one of the great advantages or the two big side benefits of nonviolent defense. The first one is that it is inherently defensive. In other words, you can't use nonviolent defense for offense to invade a country. That means that the tensions between countries would somewhat diminish to the extent that nonviolent defense became widespread. They wouldn't feel such a threat, especially if the development of nonviolent defense could go along with gradual disarmament, especially of nuclear weapons, which also would have to take place, of course. So that's one advantage, the defensive nature of nonviolent defense. And the other big advantage is that it really empowers populations. There is this wonderful phrase that has been used in different languages throughout the world by popular movements. The people united will never be defeated. But of course, the people united have often been defeated. But I think if you rephrase that to be the people united and trained in nonviolent action will never be defeated, you're much clearer. In other words, nonviolent defense is the greatest impediment to authoritarianism, which of course is a major threat in our current world. The democratic world needs a new vision of its, a new vision that captures the imagination of people. And I think what I would advocate is that just one aspect of that new vision is the idea of nonviolent defense. The people themselves can defend not only against, to deter not only foreign attacks, but also can defend themselves against authoritarianism.
Now that I'd love to see you elaborate on that, because my mind is racing around. It's easy to think of instances in which people manage to go slow and not cooperate and drag their feet in various ways to keep from implementing the orders that they're given once they're invaded. But, when you're invaded and they've actually put you in prison and you're in the gulag or something, I don't know how much protest is going to get you out. But then planning ahead, you can think if they're going to come and get me, do I have neighbors who will hide me? And plan strategies to actually resist their violence, the violence that would be imposed. And you can think of some cases of that, but it's do you want to mention any? You have already mentioned the defense of Jews by Danes, that the Germans were not able to kill as many Jews as they would have. But how much can you actually resist the invasion or the takeover by military force of another power?
I think I would respond with the case of Czechoslovakia following the Prague Spring in 1968. So there are about 7 to 8 months of a liberalizing process under the Czech Communist Party, led by Dubček at that time, which the Soviet Union took as a great threat because of a possibility of contagion to other of the Eastern European satellite countries at that time, and even to the Soviet Union itself. This idea that you could have freedom of speech, that people could have some, there could gradually be a liberalization with the Communist Party in control still. But the Communist Party was not ceding control of Czechoslovakia, but it was trying to liberalize in the sense of letting people voice their opinions and moving towards elections. So as you know, Meta, the Warsaw Pact sent in a total of eventually 500,000 troops into this relatively small country of Czechoslovakia, beginning in August 1968. And this Dubček ordered the Czech armed forces to stay in their barracks very wisely. So there was and he advised the people in a radio broadcast to resist what he called engage in passive resistance. As it turned out, there was some violent resistance. There were some people who threw Molotov cocktails and so on, trying to blow up tanks. But on the whole, it moved towards a nonviolent path and in a remarkably successful manner. So the tanks came in, but they weren't prepared to deal with a population completely opposed to their existence. What can you do with tanks when it's surrounded by people, basically in Prague? And there are all kinds of. We can't go into nonviolent resistance is a very complex area. We know of the most obvious tactics, but there are all kinds of small tactics, might call minor tactics, that people can use, which are extremely effective. I mean, in the case of Prague, I'll simply changing all the street signs, for example. So and not giving incorrect directions to Russian commanders with their tanks going down the streets, and eventually fraternizing with the troops from the various Warsaw Pact countries, since Czechs could speak Russian, and the other people spoke Russian too, even if they're not from Germany. From the it wasn't just Russian troops; it was from all 5 other Warsaw Pact nations. So the fraternization was very important. Some orders were not obeyed to repress crowds. The Soviet Union had to take the troops out and to circulate them because of the dangers that the Russian troops would actually be infected with the freedom ethos of the Czech population. So this went on for about 5 months. The Soviet Union had to negotiate with the Czech reformers. They couldn't impose their rule to begin with. Eventually, there were enough Czech communists who were willing to compromise with the Russians that there was a settlement which did lead to a reimposition of more orthodox Soviet rulership in Czechoslovakia. But there was also no punishment meted out other than the fact that people like Dubček were sent to manage power stations and that sort of thing. Well, I mean, so it wasn't overall, in the end, there was this compromise. There was a split in the Czech Communist Party. But the fact that 500,000 troops could be paralyzed through non-cooperation and troops through fraternization could be come to see the viewpoint of the Czechs. It's really a very telling example, I think.
I remember another story about the Czechs. They had a system where they send messages around to the underground, each other, secret messages, and they used a medical prescription forms. So they'd write it on, it looked like a doctor's illegible handwriting on these prescription forms. And if the guy got caught by somebody while delivering these things to the other members in the underground, he could just show them that, this is a doctor's prescription, and I don't know how to read it. It was so clever. There's you really in ingenuity. As I interrupted you, I'm sorry.
That is okay. As you asked this question about what is the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance when a major military power invades, I thought of a song. I'll read the lyrics. You'll know it soon. Day after day, alone on a hill, the man with a foolish grin is keeping perfectly still.
Okay.
Nobody wants to know him. They can see that he's just a fool, and he never gives an answer. But the fool on the hill sees the sun going down, and the eyes in his head see the world spinning round. Like, this is obviously talking about how even as it appears, the sun goes around the earth, the fool on the hill knows, he understands the dynamics of physics. He knows actually the earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around, despite appearances. And I feel this is actually a really good scientific practical metaphor for nonviolent defense, because I think the natural perception might be, because of all the stories we've heard and what it seems to be the case, that you meet violence with violence, you meet a military invasion with a military defense. But nonviolent defense, going beneath the surface, understanding the motivations of why, A, the population of an invading country would support an invasion, B, why soldiers would agree to invade another country, understanding the power behind the power, what Gene Sharp calls the social theory of power, that power depends on consent. Nonviolent defense understands if you can erode the morale and the reasons why a population would support an invasion or why soldiers would follow orders, if you can chip away at that through nonviolent resistance, you can have amazing effect, which is why all these dictatorships in the last century were overthrown mostly through nonviolence, not through violent effects. And I'm forgetting the language here, but there's in the literature on nonviolent resistance, there's actually language for the language is like mortal jiu-jitsu, which is by using nonviolent resistance against violent resistance, you're actually using the power of the opponent against them. Just like in jiu-jitsu, you use the strength and power of the opponent to defeat the opponent. So nonviolent resistance works that way. It uses the apparent weakness to turn the tables. But I think that lyric from the Beatles, like the fool in his head sees the sun going down, but in his eyes, the eye in his head sees the world going around. Like, it is like a counterintuitive understanding of power, but one that good social science and good research shows this is actually how things work. Even if on the surface we only see the violence, if we understand beneath the surface all the reasons that people obey, and we take away those reasons through nonviolent resistance, we can effectively defend countries without resorting to militaries.
I mean, the problem we have with nonviolent defense is really not the rationale for it to begin with. The rationale is strong, both in the case of Canada particularly, but in terms of demilitarization and in the longer term. So there's very strong rationale for it. There's also a strong argument for the viability of civilian-based defense or nonviolent defense. From these cases we've already discussed, that actually, even in a more or less spontaneous way, has been very effective in dealing with invasions and also with dictatorships. So the problem is really a matter of how in the world do you implement the idea? How do you get the decision makers to agree, given the existing power structure and the existing ideological context, given the existing deep cleavages within society? That these are important questions, because Gene Sharp suggested that civilian-based defense would require eventually military generals, the generals, the military brass, to accept the viability and to begin to agree on a cost-benefit analysis that they could reduce military strength in order to increase the scope of civilian-based defense. And Sharp also believed that nonviolent defense could or must be a nonpartisan policy. It must not be the policy of a single party or political movement, but simply appeal to patriotism as a basis for acceptance and adherence to civilian-based defense.
Mm-hmm.
The trouble today, of course, is that the power structures they're dealing with are not going to be susceptible to a cost-benefit analysis. Not as though we can go to Ottawa or to Washington and say, well, look at here, we've got all this evidence that actually is very effective of civilian-based defense. So viability and a strong rationale are not sufficient. We need also to have a political strategy. So the problem of nonviolent defense is part of a democratic project. It's not a project by itself, in my estimation, speaking for myself. I don't see it as something that, unlike here, I differ with Gene Sharp, who saw it as more of a technical issue. You showed the viability through research. You had experience. It worked. It became popular with people. You could bridge the political ideology, the cleavages, and develop it that way. I don't see it that way. I think the cleavages are too deep. The power structure is very, very strong, and therefore it really only comes, if we have nonviolent defense, it'll come largely through a political movement for for democratic renewal, basically. Be one aspect of a vision of democratic renewal, which we very badly need in any event to spur us in this age of increasing authoritarianism.
I don't know if this is a disagreement, but more of a different perspective, Richard, on Gene Sharp. What I view Gene Sharp was attempting to do is establish nonviolent resistance as like a real empirically based social science in a way. I don't know if he ever directly said, I believe if we just like show the science of it, governments will get aligned. In fact, like if you read his books on not like his trilogy, the Politics of Nonviolent Action from the 70s, he's pretty clear about, in every other political area, you need these types of resistance tactics. Like his book Power and Struggle basically that's like the first two paragraphs of Power and Struggle. But I think he recognized not that science alone, that you could have nonviolent defense only as a technocratic thing, but unless you had it also as a technocratic thing, it could not exist as a political movement. I mean, that's my and it's a little bit conjecture, to be fair. But I think that like what Sharp was trying to do, and I think he was successful, is establishing what is now like the field of civil resistance as an independent area of scholarship. And it's still an innovative one. It's not fully accepted as far as I understand it in political science. But the fact that you have people like Erica Chenoweth write her book in 2011 and now she teaches at Harvard, that's significant. And that only happened because Gene Sharp in the 70s was kind of the innovative scholar in this area. So as sort of a defense of, I do think what he was attempting to do, which is create a politically independent social science on nonviolent resistance, was in and of itself a valuable thing. But I agree with you, Richard, like there is no technocratic alone solution to nonviolent defense. It has to be a political movement that relies on an independent social science, but also a political movement. And I should also say, like, the success of Sharp and his successors has been that militaries have paid attention, maybe not full attention, maybe they're not considering it fully, but they have paid attention to the power of nonviolent resistance and civil resistance. And if I can say something a bit controversial here, I think militaries actually do a better job understanding the dynamics of nonviolence than a lot of people in the peace movement or in like social movements more generally. Like social movements sometimes have a very narrow understanding of what nonviolence is, but like the US Richard, please correct me which part of the military, because this is the article that we had talked about a couple months ago.
Special
The U.S.
operations.
Yeah, they have a 2-week special operations course for commanding officers on the impacts of nonviolence. And according to U.S. defense research, what Russia is really scared about is not NATO. What Russia is really scared about is that the US will fund a nonviolent resistance movement in Russia. China is also scared about that. There's this language of smart repression where governments are understanding the danger of nonviolent resistance and are coming up with their own internal, especially authoritarian governments, are coming up with their own internal ways to defend their authoritarian states because they see the danger of nonviolent resistance. I don't know if you have more to add to that, Richard, or more context.
I would just suggest that within Gene Sharp's approach, there is he's on the horns of a dilemma. He, as you said, developing nonviolent action as a subject worthy of study in academia as well as in politics was a very, very important contribution he made.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree, but go on. Sorry.
But I was saying that in his attempt to win support for this idea, he went a long way down in my view, from my reading of it, down the road of seeing it as a top-down sort of process by which you persuade and convince military and political leaders of its salience. Now that, along with his insistence on nonviolent action, nonviolent defense being a nonpartisan, has to be nonpartisan, means that it becomes a technocratic exercise because he didn't see nonviolent defense as part of a political movement, which would obviously, as a movement, would separate society into a movement and those outside the movement. So he didn't really have a way of implementing. In my critique of Gene Sharp, I have a high respect, obviously, for Gene Sharp, but my critique of him when it comes to civilian-based defense is that he didn't have a political strategy for getting civilian-based defense accepted, and the only way of doing that is to take the horns of his dilemma and really accept that as being a reality. In other words, that civilian-based defense is only going to work as part of a movement, and therefore it will not be a fully popular. You have to hope a democratic movement would have enough support within countries to make civilian-based defense the option of at least a good majority of the population. I don't see any other way around that. So in other words, the real problem with nonviolent defense is not that it could work, which I think it can. I think many people think it actually could, including as you say, the Special Operations Division of the U.S. Armed Forces, regarding it as a form of irregular warfare or asymmetric warfare, which can be very effective in opposing dictatorships. It's not that it can't work, not that it isn't a strong rationale. It is that politically, it is so hard to see how we push it forward.
Especially without popular support.
Could you just apply it to the case of Ukraine? Now, when Russia was poised on the border of Ukraine, ready to invade Kyiv in 3 years ago, I was of the mind that if I were in charge of Ukraine, I would say, okay, guys, we can't stop you. Come on in. But be aware that we're not going to cooperate with you. And you will have a hell of a hard time getting anything done that you decide that our government should try to support or that the people should follow. So if they'd been prepared at that point to use nonviolent struggle, they could have been, I don't know, similar to the situation of the Czechs, I guess, or maybe even a better situation. But that was never discussed, so far as I know. And I know some people working at peace workers in that part of Europe, in the former Soviet countries. And there was no discussion even among them about that possibility. They just believed that the only option was military. And okay, if that's what they decided, that was the outcome. But and I immediately also said, well, okay, if that's what you're going to do, God bless you. I wish you good luck. But it has not been an easy struggle, and a lot of lives have been lost because of that. But isn't that a case of what you're saying, that the problem is not whether or not it would work, and we of course don't really know how much it would work, but that you can't get it organized because people's heads are not ready for it, and that maybe political movement of some kind is required to prepare people for that option?
Yes,
You know,
I think that that is accurate. That cultural preparation work, which I would say like would go in tandem with some of like the technocratic stuff. So both the technocratic and like a cultural preparation work needs to happen. Um, people, you know, when people think about nonviolence, even people who are open to it, they think about figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King. I've been to the prairies here in Canada twice over the last couple of years, and there's a in downtown Saskatoon there's a statue of Gandhi. A couple weeks ago, I was in Winnipeg, and right outside the Human Rights Museum, there's another statue of Gandhi. And I was thinking about how you have people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi sort of symbolizing nonviolence, but that doesn't mean that people who know the symbol understand the mechanisms. They know the sign, but they don't know what is actually being signified. And I think this is actually what, and I mean that in a respectful way, because I realize the reality is if people have like a 5-minute clip they see on the news or on YouTube or whatever, that doesn't give a lot of time for understanding like, well, what is actually happening here? And it can be really easy to misunderstand it. In fact, going back to the world spinning around the sun, not the other way around, they say that it's common with children who like see the world as flat, right? It's common when children first learn the world is round, they actually picture it like a pancake because a pancake is both round and flat. So they have a misunderstanding. And I think the same thing happens with nonviolence. People have a pancake idea of nonviolence. They know it works, but they don't actually really understand the full round of how it works. And I think that's actually what we need to do. I've been to nonviolence trainings before. One of my critiques, so, there's the Gene Sharp, let's establish nonviolent think tanks method of making nonviolent defense realistic. There's also, I say this with a lot of respect for my peace elders, but there's also sort of the George Lakey, let's train social movements in nonviolence way of like spreading nonviolence. And I think both have weaknesses. I think that the weakness of the let's train social movements to use nonviolence is most of the training is very much like, how do you get arrested and maintain nonviolence, which is not bad, but that's a tactical level thing. That isn't explaining how the world is round to people who think it's a pancake. And that's what we need to do at a social level. One of the things I've proposed, forgive me if I'm talking too much. One of the things I've proposed is that in some way our coalition actually has a longer, almost like first aid style training of nonviolent defense, where it's like, in first aid training, like hundreds of people are trained every year, thousands of people are trained every year in Canada. You have to be renewed in first aid every 2 years. And that kind of emergency preparation model could be something we train people in for nonviolent defense against invasions or coups d'etats. But in that 2-day training, we focus on the mechanisms. Like, why is it? What is a security defection? Mm-hmm. And why is nonviolence better at security defections than pointing a gun at someone's face?
Beautiful.
Well, let me say that I agree with what you said, but I would like to say a bit more about Ukraine, if I may, because that's what Meta asked to begin with. Because I think it was one of the tragedies of Ukraine, the biggest tragedy of Ukraine is that it didn't develop a program of nonviolent defense prior to the Russian invasion. As you say, it wasn't part of the mentality. The result is enormous loss, enormous casualties, incredible damage. That was not inevitable. I also say, secondly, that there was a nonviolent defense by Ukrainians in the first weeks of the Russian invasion, and it was very effective. In other words, people spontaneously at the village levels were very, very angry with the Russians, and there are many instances of Ukrainians gathering in occupied villages, singing the national anthem, and women scolding the Russian soldiers in Russian. What do they think they were doing there, and being blocking bridges to prevent passage of tanks and military personnel. So there was a lot of spontaneous nonviolent resistance. The tragedy is that Ukraine had no idea by that time. The high point of nonviolent defense was really about the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, because at that point, people in many countries around Russia understood the importance of nonviolence because they won their independence largely in this way. That kind of knowledge seemed to dissipate when NATO came on the scene, and seemed to be one wanted to join NATO, and Ukraine wanted to join NATO too. So it got off into the military path. And the tragedy is that Ukraine is now in this awful situation today. And I don't think it was inevitable.
Well, I think I think everybody is pretty much in agreement now. I agree with both of you, and I think you agree with each other pretty much. So now, since you're actually working on a plan to get Canada prepared psychologically and maybe also strategically, tell me how people can get in touch with you, because if people want to follow up on and see what you're planning and maybe participate, I want to put a little blurb on, or at least the link where they can get in touch with you and participate. Richard, you're the head honcho in this project. How should people contact you if they want to join your effort?
Well, first of all, I'm not the head honcho. We are both head honchos. And I must say,
with Jan from Conscience Canada, three head honchos.
We're a very egalitarian group. And actually, I have to make clear that Isaiah has way more capability than I do in the way of organizing people. So I'm not the head honcho. But what I can do is offer one easy way of contacting us. And perhaps Isaiah has another way, but I would say they can contact us through info@scienceforpeace.org. info@scienceforpeace.org. And that'll get to us.
Fine. Thank you.
I would also add, Richard, please let us know what it is exactly. But the Canadian Coalition recently launched our social media. We have like an Instagram page right now. I actually don't remember what the ad. I don't use social media that much, so I can't remember it. But Meta, we can send it to you afterwards, and you could post it on YouTube or whatever. So we have an Instagram page. We will also have a long email list that people can sign up for to get monthly newsletters. That is in process. I want to emphasize that as a coalition, there's maybe 4 or 5 grassroots peace groups that are part of it, each contributing as they're able. But as grassroots peace groups, we don't yet have resources. So we're connected, for example, to the Federation for Social Defense in Germany, which is like a long-standing social movement with paid staff and that kind of thing. We do not have that, or maybe more optimistically, we do not have that yet. So we will have a newsletter. So besides the email, besides the social media, stay tuned, because we will have a newsletter that's launching shortly.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
May I just say one more thing, and that is that this coalition is an example of what citizens can do without any resources whatsoever, because we spent almost no money, and we've operated since June, and we managed to have to bring a lot of people in that way. So a lot cannot be achieved.
What's the title of the coalition?
The Canadian Coalition for Nonviolent Defence.
All right, and you've got an Instagram page, right?
No.
All right, everybody, pay attention. because they're coming to get you. All right, thanks, guys. It's been fun, and good luck. Every good wish for you, because you're the way of you're the solution. Bless you. Bye.